The lake was still at 5:47 in the morning, still like something holding its breath. Wren Vance stood at the end of the dock with a rifle she'd built herself. Piece by piece, the way her father taught her. Barrel cold under her palm. Breath slow. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. A rhythm older than grief. 300 yards out, a Coke can balanced on a fence post at the edge of the tree line. Small, almost invisible in the gray light. Almost. She didn't need the scope to know she'd hit it. She needed the scope because her father used to say precision wasn't about skill. It was about respect. Respect for the shot. Respect for the distance. Respect for everything that could go wrong between the trigger and the target. She exhaled halfway. Held it. Fired. The can spun off the post and vanished into the brush with a metallic clatter that cracked the silence in half. Somewhere behind her, a dog barked. Not hers. She didn't keep dogs. Dogs needed you to come home, and she wasn't always sure she would. She lowered the rifle, set it against her shoulder, and for 1 second, just one, she let herself remember the last time she'd fired a shot like that, with someone standing next to her, calling wind speed into her ear like it was the only language that mattered. Then she shut the memory down, because that's what discipline was for. Because if she let it in, all of it, she wouldn't be standing on this dock. She'd be on the floor. The cabin behind her was small. 1 story. Cedar siding gone silver with weather. A wood stove that did most of the heavy lifting in winter. A single photograph on the mantel, turned slightly toward the window so the morning light hit it first, before it hit anything else in the room. Senior Chief Daniel Vance. Navy SEAL. 22 years of service. Husband. Father. Ghost. 8 years today. She hadn't planned to go to the ceremony. She'd told herself that every year since the first one, standing at attention in a black dress that felt like a costume, watching men she'd known her whole childhood fold a flag into a triangle and hand it to a woman who could barely stand. But this year was different. This year, Admiral Marcus Holt was speaking, and Wren didn't know Holt. Not really. Not the way her father had known him, but she knew the name. She'd seen it on letters, on files she wasn't supposed to have seen, tucked in a box her mother left behind when she passed 2 years after Dad did. Like grief was contagious, and she'd caught the terminal strain. She hadn't planned to go, except something in her had been restless for weeks. A prickling at the back of the neck, the kind of feeling her father used to call situational awareness, and her mother used to call anxiety, and Wren had learned the hard way that it was usually the first one. She went inside, made coffee she wouldn't finish, stood in front of the mirror in her bedroom and looked at the black dress hanging on the closet door like it had been waiting for her to lose an argument with herself. And on the dresser, next to a stack of unopened mail, sat a small velvet box. She opened it. Inside a trident, gold, worn smooth at the edges from being held, not from being displayed. Her father's. The only thing of his the Navy had let her mother keep besides the flag. She picked it up, turned it over, felt the weight of it settle into her palm like it belonged there. Which it did, because he'd given it to her himself. Before everything. She pinned it to the inside of her jacket, where it wouldn't show unless she wanted it to. A habit, old and quiet and hers. Then she got in the truck and drove 2.5 hours toward the coast, toward a naval base full of people who used to know her father and had never once bothered to know her. The drive gave her too much time to think, and thinking was the enemy. So she counted mile markers instead. She'd learned that trick from him too. When the mind wants to spiral, give it a task. Give it numbers. Give it something small and stupid and countable. Because the alternative is the mind finding its own way back to a mountainside 8 years ago, and she was not doing that today. Except her mind didn't listen. It never did, not when it came to him. She remembered being 19, remembered a night that didn't officially exist, not in any file, not in any record, because some things get written down and some things get buried so deep, even the people who buried them forget where they put the shovel. She remembered her father's voice. Low, urgent, not the voice he used at home. She remembered heat and noise, and the specific singular silence that comes after an explosion, When your ears are still ringing but the world has gone completely, terribly quiet. She remembered a scar forming on her collarbone that never fully faded. Star-shaped. Pale now, raised at the edges, and she remembered that he never let her explain to anyone what happened that night. Not because he was ashamed. Because he was protecting her from something bigger than either of them, which meant she'd spent 8 years protecting a silence she didn't fully understand herself. The truck hit a pothole, jolted her back into the present. Good. She needed the present. The present was a 2-lane highway and a gas station up ahead, and a stomach that hadn't eaten since yesterday because grief did that to her, shrank her appetite down to nothing, made food feel like a betrayal of the day. She didn't stop for gas. She had enough. She kept driving. By the time the base came into view, the flags, the guard gate, the long stretch of manicured lawn leading to the memorial wall, where names were etched into black granite like a promise nobody could keep her hands, had gone cold on the wheel. Because this was the part she hated most, not the grief. She'd made peace with grief, or something close enough to peace that it didn't wake her screaming anymore. It was the people, the way they looked at her, some with sympathy, some with something else. Something that lived closer to suspicion, because Wren Vance was the daughter of a legend, and legends left behind daughters who were either worshipped or watched. She'd learned a long time ago which one she was. The ceremony grounds were already filling by the time she found parking. Rows of folding chairs facing a podium. A Navy band tuning up somewhere behind a row of trees. Men in dress blues. Women in black. Children who didn't understand yet what this day meant, running between chair rows while their grandmothers hissed at them to be still. Wren stood at the back. Always the back. It was easier to leave from the back. She scanned the crowd the way she scanned everything left to right, methodical, cataloging exits, cataloging faces. A habit that had outlived its usefulness years ago and stuck around anyway, the way habits do when they're the only thing left of who you used to be. That's when she saw him. Admiral Marcus Holt, 60 years old, maybe older, silver-haired, spine straight as a flagpole, standing near the podium in a uniform so crisp it looked freshly pressed for exactly this moment. He wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking at the wall, at the names, at one name in particular. Wren watched him for a long moment, and she thought not for the first time that grief looked the same on everyone, no matter the rank. She didn't approach him. What would she even say? "Hello, Admiral. My father died under your command, and no one has ever told me the truth about how." So she stayed at the back, arms crossed, waiting for the ceremony to start so it could end, so she could go home to her lake and her rifle and her silence. Except someone was watching her. She felt it before she saw it. The old prickling at the back of her neck, sharper now, insistent. She turned her head. Slowly. The way you turn when you don't want the thing watching you to know you've noticed. A man in a gray suit stood near the edge of the parking lot, half hidden by a support column. Not military. Not veteran either. Not with that posture, too stiff, too studied, like someone who'd learned to stand at attention from a manual instead of from years of muscle memory. He had a phone to his ear, and his eyes were on her. She looked away first. Because that's what you did. You didn't confirm you'd made someone. You filed it away and you waited. Her father's voice again, quiet in the back of her skull. Assume every eye is a camera and every ear is a recorder. Rennie, act like it's already being written down. The ceremony began. An officer she didn't recognize stepped up to the podium and started reading names, one by one. Slow and heavy, the way names are read when each one used to belong to a whole person and now belongs to a wall. Wren's chest tightened when he reached the V's. Vance, Senior Chief Daniel R. Vance, United States Navy, killed in the line of duty. That was it. That was all the official record said. Killed in the line of duty. 4 words standing in for a night that had rearranged the entire architecture of her life and left her with a scar and a silence and a trident she wasn't supposed to have and definitely wasn't supposed to wear. She reached up, touched the inside of her jacket where the pin sat hidden, and that's when she noticed the man in the gray suit had moved. Closer now, no longer hiding behind the column. He wasn't alone anymore either. 2 more men in similar suits had joined him, flanking the edge of the crowd like they were waiting for a cue. Ren's pulse ticked up. Not panic. Not yet. Just awareness. The old instinct sharpening itself against the whetstone of 8 years of watching her own back. The officer at the podium kept reading names. The crowd kept its silence, heads bowed, hands folded. And Admiral Holt, she noticed this only because she was still watching him, still trying to read whatever grief lived behind that composed face. Admiral Holt had turned his head. He was looking at her now, directly at her. Something crossing his expression that she couldn't quite name. Recognition, maybe, or the beginning of it. The way you look at someone when a piece of a puzzle you didn't know you were holding suddenly seems like it might but fit somewhere. She didn't have time to wonder about it, because that's when the man in the gray suit started walking toward her, and the 2 behind him fell into step. And the crowd, the whole crowd, hundreds of people who had come to mourn began, one by one, to notice. Ren Vance. The voice came from behind her, flat and procedural, the kind of voice that had said this exact sentence 100 times before, and would say it 100 times again without losing any of its weight. She turned, slowly, because turning fast, in front of a crowd like this, in front of men like this, was how misunderstandings turned into headlines. That's me. The lead agent held up a badge. NCIS. Federal. Not local police. Not base security.
Federal.
I'm Special Agent Bryce Coleman. I need you to come with us. Which was not a request. Which was never going to be a request. Ren felt the eyes of the crowd land on her like weight. Physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, on her spine. Can I ask what this is regarding? You can ask. Coleman's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. Doesn't mean I answer. Behind him, one of the other agents was already unclipping something from his belt. Metal. Cold looking even from a distance. And Ren, standing in a black dress with her father's trident pinned inside her jacket where no one could see it, felt the first real spike of fear crack through the discipline she'd spent 8 years building. Because this wasn't random. Because federal agents didn't show up at a military memorial ceremony to make a random arrest. They showed up because someone told them to. Because someone had built a file. Because someone, somewhere, had spent time deciding that today, this specific day, this specific ceremony, in front of this specific crowd was the day to do this. Ma'am. Coleman's voice again, flatter now, impatient. Turn around. Hands behind your back. The crowd had gone completely silent. Not the reverent silence of the ceremony. A different silence. The kind that comes right before people start whispering. Ren's mind raced through options the way it had been trained to. Run, no. Running confirmed guilt. And there was nowhere to run to anyway. Not with 2 more agents flanking the exits she'd already mapped without meaning to. Fight, absolutely not. Not against 3 federal agents in front of a crowd that included active duty personnel who'd be legally required to intervene. Comply comply and figure out later. Figure out from a position where she still had rights, still had a voice, even if that voice was currently locked behind an NDA she'd signed at 19 and never fully understood the weight of. So she turned around. What's this about? She asked again, quieter now, because the fight had already left her voice, and something colder had taken its place. Coleman answered as the cuffs closed around her wrists, cold metal biting into skin already gone numb with shock. Fraudulent representation of military service. Violation of the Stolen Valor Act, Title 18, Section 704. A pause, deliberate, cruel in its precision. You're under arrest for impersonating a United States Navy SEAL. The words landed like a physical blow, like the concussion of something exploding close enough to feel but far enough not to kill. Behind her, someone in the crowd gasped. A woman's voice, somewhere near the front row. Then a murmur, low and spreading, the way fire spreads through dry grass, slow at first, then all at once. Ren opened her mouth to say something, anything, to explain that she'd never claimed to be a SEAL, never once, not to a single person, that the trident pinned inside her jacket had been given to her by her father with his own hands, except she couldn't say any of that. Because the moment she opened her mouth to explain the trident, she'd have to explain why he gave it to her. And explaining why meant explaining what happened on that mountainside 8 years ago. And what happened on that mountainside was still classified, still buried under a wall of paperwork she'd signed as a terrified 19-year-old who just wanted to go home and had no idea what she was agreeing to. So she said nothing, which, to a crowd of hundreds of strangers watching a woman get handcuffed at a military memorial, looked exactly like guilt. That's not. The words came out anyway, cracked and small, before she could stop them. I never said I was a SEAL. I never told anyone that. Save it, Coleman said, already guiding her forward by the elbow, firm but not gentle. You can explain it downtown. The crowd parted as they walked her through it. Faces she half recognized from a childhood spent on this base, on bases like it. Faces that had once looked at her with warmth, now looking at her with something closer to betrayal. A father's daughter, disgraced in front of his own memorial wall. She kept her eyes forward, chin level, because that was the only dignity left available to her, and she was not giving it up too, except for one moment, one single moment, as they passed the podium, as the officer who'd been reading names stood frozen mid-sentence with the microphone, forgotten in his hand. Wren's eyes met Admiral Holt's. He hadn't moved, hadn't said a word, but his expression had changed completely from the composed grief of a moment before. Now there was something sharper there, something urgent. He was staring at her collarbone, at the place where, in the chaos of the arrest, her jacket had shifted just slightly, just enough, to reveal a thin white line of scar tissue peeking above the collar of her dress. Star-shaped, pale, raised at the edges. For 1 second, Wren thought she saw something in the Admiral's face that looked almost like recognition, like fear, like a man watching a ghost walk past him in broad daylight. Then the agents pulled her forward, out of his line of sight, and the moment was gone. But it stayed with her, all the way to the car, all the way through the drive to the federal building, all the way through the humiliating shuffle from vehicle to building to holding room, past a security desk, past a row of chairs bolted to the floor, past 100 small indignities designed to strip a person down to nothing but a case number. Because in 8 years of guarding a secret, in 8 years of silence so total it had become a second skin, no one had ever looked at her scar and looked afraid. Until today, the holding room smelled like industrial cleaner and old coffee, fluorescent light buzzing overhead in a frequency just annoying enough to fray the edges of a person's patience. Wren sat at a metal table, wrists no longer cuffed, but wrapped in the ghost ache of where the cuffs had been. Across from her, Agent Coleman flipped through a manila folder with the casual cruelty of someone who'd already decided the ending of the story and was only reading through it to confirm his own conclusion. Let's start simple, he said. Where'd you serve? Nowhere, nowhere. He said it like it was a punchline, so you've never been in the military. That's right. Then explain the trident. Wren's jaw tightened. It was my father's. Your father's. Coleman flipped a page. Senior Chief Daniel Vance. SEAL Team 7. Killed 8 years ago. He looked up. You've been telling people at veteran fundraisers you served alongside him. That you were unofficially attached to his unit. That you completed missions no official record shows you were ever part of. I never said that. We have testimony that says otherwise. Then your testimony is lying. Coleman leaned back, something almost like amusement flickering across his face, the specific kind of amusement that belongs to men who've never once had to doubt whether the system was working correctly, because the system had never once worked against them. Funny, he said, because we've got video. Charity gala, 11 months ago. You're on stage. Someone introduces you as the daughter who followed in her father's footsteps. You don't correct them. Which was true. Wren remembered that night. Remembered standing on a stage she hadn't wanted to be on, at an event she'd only agreed to because it raised money for the families of fallen SEALs. Families like hers had once been. Remembered an MC some retired officer she'd never met before that night, introducing her with language that was flattering and vague and completely, dangerously misleading. And remembered not correcting him, because correcting him meant explaining. and explaining meant the mountainside. And the mountainside was locked behind a door she'd sworn, at 19, never to open. So she'd smiled, said thank you, let the room believe whatever it wanted to believe. A mistake. She understood that now, sitting in this room with a federal agent building a case out of her silence. But not a crime. Or not the crime he thought it was. I didn't correct him, she said slowly, because I didn't think one sentence from a stranger mattered enough to interrupt a fundraiser for grieving families. Convenient, true. Coleman studied her for a long moment, and Wren studied him right back, cataloging the way his eyes kept flicking down to the folder, down to a specific page he hadn't shown her yet, down to something that seemed to be bothering him more than he wanted to admit. There's something else, he said finally. Careful now. The cruelty from before had thinned out into something closer to confusion. Your prints came back partial flagged. Meaning what? Meaning most of your file is normal. Birth certificate, social security, standard civilian record. He tapped the folder. Except for a gap. 8 years ago. 6 weeks. Completely blank. No school records, no medical records. Nothing. He paused. That doesn't happen by accident. Records don't go blank on their own. Someone has to make them blank. Wren's pulse ticked up, but she kept her face still. Because this was the part she'd been trained for, if you could call 8 years of silence and paranoia training. This was the part where one wrong word could unravel everything, and one right word could unravel everything else. I don't know anything about a gap, she said. Which was technically a lie. Which was technically the only kind of lie she'd been allowed to tell for 8 years. Coleman didn't look convinced, but before he could push further, the door opened. A woman in a lab coat stepped in, holding a clipboard, all business. Booking intake requires a full physical description for the record. Scars, tattoos, distinguishing marks. Coleman waved a hand, irritated at the interruption, but unwilling to fight federal procedure. Make it quick. The woman approached Wren with the clipboard, running through the standard checklist: height, weight, eye color, until she reached the collar of Wren's dress, where the jacket had shifted hours ago and never quite settled back into place. There's a scar here, the woman said, more to herself than to anyone else, tilting her head slightly. Collarbone. Star pattern. She reached for a small handheld scanner, the kind used to photograph identifying marks for the record. This is unusual. Consistent with high-velocity shrapnel fragmentation, not a typical accident pattern. Coleman glanced up, mildly annoyed. Just log it. I am logging it. The woman scanned the mark, and the small device beeped once, twice, then made a sound neither Wren nor Coleman expected: a sharp, insistent alert tone. The woman frowned at the screen. That's strange. What? It flagged a database match. She turned the screen toward Coleman. This exact scar pattern and location is already logged in a federal record system, cross-referenced to an incident report. Coleman stood, suddenly interested in a way he hadn't been a moment ago. What incident? The woman scrolled, squinted. It's redacted. A pause. Not missing. Redacted. There's a difference. Because missing meant nothing had ever existed, and redacted meant something had existed, and someone with enough power had decided the world wasn't allowed to know what. Coleman's expression shifted from irritation to something sharper. He took the scanner himself, staring at the screen like it had personally insulted him. This report, he said slowly, requires a clearance level I don't have. Wren sat very still, very, very still, because her heart was pounding so hard she was afraid it might be audible in the small room, and because some small, terrified part of her, the part that had spent 8 years bracing for exactly this moment without ever admitting she was bracing for anything, understood, in that instant, that the wall she'd built around the mountainside had just developed its first crack. And walls don't stay standing once they start to crack. They come down all at once. 2 floors above the holding room, in an office with a view of the harbor and a Navy flags standing stiff in the corner, Admiral Marcus Holt sat with his hands folded on his desk and his mind 8 years and 3,000 miles away. He hadn't been able to focus since the ceremony, hadn't been able to shake the image of that scar. star-shaped, pale, raised at the edges. He knew that scar. Not from memory of seeing it in person. He'd never met Ren Vance before today. Not really. Not beyond a handshake at a funeral, where he'd said all the appropriate words and meant none of them the way he should have. He knew that scar from a photograph. A single photograph taken by a combat medic 8 years ago, attached to an after-action report that Holt himself had signed, sealed, and buried so deep in the classification system that he'd half convinced himself over the years that it had simply ceased to exist. A phone rang on his desk. He let it ring twice before answering, because his hands weren't quite steady yet, and he needed the 2 rings to steady them. Holt, Admiral. The voice on the other end belonged to his aide, young and clipped and entirely unaware of the earthquake happening in his commanding officer's chest. NCIS flagged a database match during a booking intake downtown. Scar pattern cross-referenced to Incident Report 118 Delta. Systems requesting clearance authorization from the original signing officer. Holt closed his eyes. 118 Delta. He hadn't heard that designation spoken aloud in 8 years. He'd hoped he never would again. "Send it to me," he said. His voice came out steadier than he felt, which was, he supposed, the entire point of 35 years of naval discipline. Immediately. "Yes, sir." He hung up, sat alone in the silence of his office, staring at the harbor without seeing it, because he remembered that night. Remembered it in pieces, the way memory works when the mind tries to protect itself from its own worst moments. He remembered a mission gone sideways in a location that officially did not exist, on a night that officially did not happen, involving a senior chief who officially had broken protocol so severely that the Navy could have court-martialed him twice over, except the Navy hadn't, because the man who'd broken protocol was dead by morning, and dead men don't stand trial. And the girl he'd broken protocol for, the girl who wasn't supposed to be there, wasn't supposed to exist in any official capacity connected to that mission, had survived. Barely, with a scar on her collarbone and a silence sealed around her by an NDA that a shell-shocked 19-year-old had signed in a hospital bed without fully understanding what she was giving up. Holt had signed off on that NDA too, had told himself at the time that it was mercy, that burying the truth protected her from a court-martial by association, protected her father's legacy, protected the men who died alongside him from having their sacrifice reduced to a scandal about a civilian on a classified op. He'd told himself a lot of things 8 years ago. He hadn't told himself the truth. Not the whole truth, because the whole truth was uglier than a broken protocol. The whole truth involved a leak, a location compromised, an ambush that should never have been possible unless someone, somewhere in the chain, had sold that information to people who wanted Daniel Vance's team dead. Holt had spent 8 years chasing that truth in the quiet margins of his career, in classified inquiries that kept dead-ending, in a folder in his personal safe that he opened maybe twice a year and closed again just as fast, because every time he looked at it, he saw a senior chief bleeding out on a mountainside, while his daughter screamed his name, and he saw his own signature on the report that made sure the world would never ask why. A knock at the door pulled him back. "Come in." His aide stepped inside, holding a tablet. "Sir, report 118 Delta, pulled per your authorization." He hesitated. "There's something else. NCIS is proceeding with the arraignment on the stolen valor charge. Booking's already been processed. Unless someone with sufficient authority intervenes." "I'm intervening," Holt said, already rising from his chair, already reaching for his cap. "Get my car." "Sir, may I ask?" Holt said, not unkindly. "You may not. Because some things a man had to see with his own eyes before he could say them out loud to anyone else." And Marcus Holt had spent 8 years not looking closely enough at a scar in a photograph. He wasn't making that mistake twice. Downtown, in a holding cell with cinder block walls painted the exact gray of every institutional building Wren had ever set foot in, she sat on a thin metal bench and tried to control her breathing the way her father had taught her. In through the nose, 4 counts. Hold, 4 counts. Out through the mouth, 4 counts. It wasn't working. Not entirely. because the box method was designed for combat stress, for the specific adrenaline spike of a firefight. And this was a different kind of terror. Slower. Colder. The terror of watching a secret you've protected for 8 years start to slip out of your hands regardless of how tightly you held it. She thought about her father. Not the memorial version of him. Not the folded flag and the granite wall and the careful, sanitized language of official mourning. She thought about the real him. The one who used to wake her before dawn to run 3 miles through fog so thick it swallowed the trail ahead. The one who taught her to read wind through grass, through smoke, through the subtle bend of a distant flag. Because he said the day would come when she'd need to know these things, and he wasn't going to let that day catch her unprepared. She hadn't understood, at 15, why a Navy SEAL was training his daughter like she might someday need those skills for something real. She'd thought it was bonding. Father-daughter time dressed up as survival training. She understood now. Had understood, actually, since the moment on that mountainside when everything he'd taught her, the breathing, the stillness, the cold, clear focus, was the only reason she'd survived at all. Because he'd known. Somehow, some way, he'd known that danger was coming for their family long before it arrived, and he'd spent years preparing her for it the only way he knew how, quietly, patiently, without ever explaining why. The cell door buzzed. Unlocked. Wren looked up, expecting Coleman, expecting another round of questions she couldn't fully answer. Instead, a different man stood in the doorway. Older. Silver hair cropped close, a face weathered by decades of sun and salt and something heavier than either. He wore civilian clothes, a plain button-down, sleeves rolled, but he carried himself the way military men carried themselves even out of uniform. Spine straight, shoulders set, a stillness that came from decades of learning how to stand at attention without being told to. Wren Vance? She didn't answer right away. Something about him was familiar, though she couldn't place it. Not exactly. Not until he stepped fully into the light, and she saw the small silver dolphin pin on his collar, the emblem of a submariner, of all things, from a career decades removed from anything he was doing now. Dale Whitfield, he said, sitting down across from her without waiting for an invitation. Everyone calls me preacher. Your father called me preacher too. Back when he still could. Wren's breath caught. You knew him. Served with him. Long time ago. Before I went to law school and started fighting battles with paperwork instead of rifles. Preacher's mouth curved. Not quite a smile. Something older and sadder than that. I'm here because I heard what happened. And because your father asked me for a favor, once, a long time ago. Told me if anything ever happened to him, if his girl ever needed someone in her corner who understood what silence like this actually costs, I was supposed to show up. Wren's throat tightened. He said that? He said exactly that. Preacher pulled a legal pad from his bag. All business now, the softness folding itself away behind decades of courtroom discipline. So here I am. Late. 8 years late. But here. They think I claim to be a SEAL, Wren said. The words coming out rushed now, the dam finally cracking under the weight of hours of forced silence. I never said that. Not once. I don't know who told them I did, but it's not I know, Preacher said, cutting her off, not unkindly. I've seen the complaint. Someone built this case carefully, too carefully for it to be random. He tapped his pen against the pad. Which means someone wanted you arrested, specifically, publicly. At that ceremony, on that day, in front of that crowd. Wren went still. Why would anyone want that? Preacher's eyes met hers, and for the first time since he'd walked in, she saw something in his expression that looked almost like fear. That, he said quietly, is the question I've been trying to answer for 8 years. And I think whoever did this knows exactly what happened on that mountainside. I think they've known the whole time. And I think they're terrified of what happens if the wrong person ever finds out the truth. The cell door buzzed again. Both of them turned, and standing in the doorway, flanked by 2 uniformed officers who looked distinctly uncomfortable about the entire situation, was Admiral Marcus Holt, still in the dress uniform he'd worn to the ceremony hours earlier. face pale in a way that had nothing to do with the fluorescent lighting. He looked at Preacher first, some flicker of recognition passing between two old veterans who'd clearly crossed paths before, in circumstances Wren didn't yet understand. Then he looked at her face, at her eyes, at the collar of her dress where the scar was still faintly visible. "Miss Vance," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on her name, the composure of 35 years of command fraying at the edges. "I need you to tell me something, and I need you to tell me the truth, because I think I already know the answer, and I think I've known it for 8 years, and I think I owe you an apology so large I don't know where to begin." Wren's heart pounded against her ribs. "What do you want to know?" Holt stepped fully into the cell, reached into his jacket, pulled out a single photograph, worn at the edges from years of being taken out and put away. Taken out and put away, he turned it toward her. It was a photograph of the scar. Her scar, star-shaped, pale, raised at the edges. Taken 8 years ago, in a field hospital she barely remembered, by a medic whose name she'd never known. "This is you," Holt said. Not a question. A confirmation he already believed, and desperately needed to hear anyway. "You were there that night. On the mountainside. You were the civilian in the after-action report, the one we sealed, the one we told the world didn't exist." Wren's hands began to shake. 8 years of silence. 8 years of carrying a truth so heavy it had reshaped the entire architecture of who she was. 8 years of watching her father's memory get flattened into 4 cold words on a granite wall, killed in the line of duty, while the real story sat locked in a file she wasn't allowed to open. And now, in a holding cell with cinder block walls and fluorescent light, and a lawyer who'd promised her dead father he'd show up, and an admiral holding a photograph of her own scar like it was a confession he'd been carrying for 8 years. Now, finally, someone was asking. "Yes," Wren said, and the word came out smaller than she meant it to, cracked open by 8 years of holding it in. "That's me." Holt closed his eyes. When he opened them again, something in his face had shifted completely: grief, guilt, and underneath it, something sharper. Something that looked almost like resolve. "Then I owe you the truth," he said. "All of it. Because I think what happened to your father wasn't an accident. I think someone sold his location that night. I think that person is still out there. And I think—" He paused, glancing at Preacher, then back at Wren, his voice dropping into something low and urgent. "I think whoever arranged your arrest today did it because they're terrified you're about to find out who." Outside the cell, unnoticed by anyone in the room, a man in a gray suit stood near the security desk, phone pressed to his ear, watching the scene through a narrow window, with an expression that had gone entirely carefully blank. "She's talking to Holt," he said quietly into the phone. "Both of them. Right now." A pause, a voice on the other end, tight with something that might have been fear. "Then we're out of time," the voice said. "Do what we discussed." The man in the gray suit slipped the phone into his pocket and walked away, footsteps unhurried, calm, the calm of a man who'd already decided what came next. Behind him, inside the cell, Wren Vance sat between a lawyer who'd promised her father he'd show up, and an admiral who'd spent 8 years carrying a guilt he was only now beginning to name. And for the first time since the mountainside, she felt something other than fear. She felt the wall crack all the way open. And on the other side of it, waiting in the dark like it had been waiting for 8 patient years, was the truth. They arrested her for faking as a SEAL, until the Admiral saw her legendary scar Part 2. The cell door stayed open, but nobody moved for a long time, because there are moments when the body understands something before the mind catches up. And this was one of them. Wren sat frozen between an admiral holding a photograph of her own scar and a lawyer scribbling notes fast enough to tear the paper. And she thought clearly, distinctly, the way you think one true thing in the middle of 100 false ones. This is the moment everything changes. "We can't do this here," Holt said finally. His voice had dropped into something low. Command voice. The voice of a man used to giving orders in rooms where lives depended on getting them right. Cameras. Recorders. Anyone with the right clearance could be listening. Preacher didn't look up from his notepad. "Then we move her." "On what authority?" On mine. Preacher finally lifted his eyes, and there was nothing soft left in them now. Nothing of the gentle old submariner who'd walked in 20 minutes ago. I'm her attorney of record as of 90 seconds from now, and I'm invoking client confidentiality and a demand for immediate release pending review of a wrongfully filed charge. You want to argue jurisdiction with me, Admiral? I'll remind you I spent 30 years arguing worse cases in front of worse men than you. Holt almost smiled. Almost. You haven't changed, neither have you, which is why I still don't fully trust you. The words landed flat and hard, and Wren watched something pass between the two old men. History, complicated and unspoken, the kind that only exists between people who've buried friends together. Fair, Holt said quietly. You shouldn't. They processed her release in under an hour, which, Wren would later understand, was not how federal bureaucracy normally worked, not without an admiral standing at the booking desk with his jaw set, and his voice pitched low enough that every clerk in the building suddenly found urgent reasons to move paperwork faster. By the time she stepped out of the federal building, the sun had shifted low and orange across the parking lot, throwing long shadows that looked, to her exhausted eyes, almost like the shadows of trees on a mountainside she hadn't let herself think about in years. Holt was waiting by a black sedan. Alone, no driver, no aide. Get in, he said. Wren hesitated, because trust, real trust, wasn't something she handed out easily anymore. Hadn't been since the mountainside, since the silence, since 8 years of learning that even people who loved you could disappear without explanation if the wrong forces decided they needed to. Where are we going? Somewhere private. Somewhere I can tell you what I know without worrying about who's listening. Holt's eyes were steady, tired but steady. You deserve the truth, Miss Vance. 8 years late, but you deserve it. Preacher nodded at her, a small encouraging gesture. Go on, I'll follow. So she got in the car. The safe house, if that's what it was. A modest 2-story home on a quiet residential street, 40 minutes inland. Nothing about it suggesting anything other than an ordinary retired officer's ordinary retirement. Smelled like coffee and old books. Holt closed the blinds before he spoke. A small gesture. A habit built from decades of handling things that couldn't survive daylight. I need to show you something, he said. And I need you to understand what I'm about to tell you. I've never told anyone outside a classified briefing room. Not my wife, not my own children. I'm telling you because I think you already know most of it. You just don't know you know it. He set a thick folder on the table between them. Wren stared at it like it might detonate. 8 years ago, Holt began. Your father's team was assigned to a reconnaissance mission in a region I'm not authorized to name specifically, even now. High-value intelligence gathering. Low visibility. The kind of operation that officially doesn't exist on paper, even in classified paper, because the political fallout of it existing would have been significant. I know that part, Wren said quietly. I was there. Holt's eyes flicked up, sharp. That's exactly the part I need you to help me understand. Because officially you were never there. There is no civilian authorization on file. No transport manifest. No medical clearance. Nothing. He tapped the folder. Your father brought you onto that operation completely outside protocol, and I need to know why. Because I've spent 8 years assuming I understood the reason, and I think I've been wrong. Wren's hands curled into fists in her lap. He didn't want to, she said slowly. Bring me. He fought it. I remember him fighting it. Then why? Because I followed him. The words came out rough, dragged up from a place she'd sealed shut for years. He was training me. Had been, since I was 15. Marksmanship. Field tactics. Survival. I don't know what I thought it was. Bonding. A game. And then one night I overheard him on a secure line, talking about a mission that sounded wrong from the first sentence. Sounded like something he wasn't sure he'd come back from. She stopped, breathed, forced herself to keep going, because stopping now meant never finishing, and she was done with unfinished things. So I followed him to the staging point. Snuck onto the transport. I was 19 and I thought I was invincible, and I thought if something happened to him, I needed to be there. I needed to help. Her voice cracked. By the time he found me, we were already past the point of turning back. Holt's face had gone pale. He covered for you. He had no choice. Reporting me meant scrubbing the mission. Scrubbing the mission meant losing critical intelligence windows his team had spent months building. He made a call. The wrong call, probably. But it was his to make, and he made it. And then he spent the rest of that night trying to keep me alive because of a decision that was entirely his own fault. Silence settled over the room, heavy, complete. Which means, Holt said slowly, working through it out loud, the after-action report I signed, the one that sealed everything, buried everything, protected everything, wasn't protecting a covert program. It wasn't protecting some experimental initiative involving women in combat roles. It was protecting your father's career and your safety from the fallout of a father who broke every rule in the book because his daughter followed him into a war zone. Yes, Holt exhaled, long and slow, and something in his shoulders sagged, the weight of 8 years of misunderstanding finally settling into its correct shape. I built an entire theory around this, he admitted. Around you. I thought, God help me, I thought maybe you'd been part of something bigger. Some quiet pilot program nobody above my clearance told me about. I chased that theory for years and it led nowhere because it was never the right theory to begin with. I'm sorry, Wren said, and meant it, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was apologizing for. 8 years of someone else's confusion, maybe. Or the small, ridiculous guilt of disappointing a man who'd built an entire secret mythology around her that turned out to be smaller and sadder and far more human than he had imagined. Don't be, Holt shook his head. The mythology was never the point. What matters is what happened after. He opened the folder. The mountainside came back to her in pieces, the way trauma always did, not linear, not complete, but sharp fragments arriving out of order, each one dragging its own particular weight. Cold air, thin at that altitude, hard to pull into her lungs. Her father's hand closing around her arm, dragging her down behind a rock outcropping, seconds before the world turned to noise and light. His voice, not the training voice, not the calm instructor's voice she'd known her whole life, but something rawer. Something afraid shouting coordinates into a radio that wasn't answering. They knew where we were, Wren said now, her voice flat, reciting a memory she'd rehearsed in silence 1,000 times but never spoken aloud. Before we even got into position, they were waiting. My father kept saying it into the radio. They knew. They knew. Like he couldn't understand how. Because the location had only been shared with a handful of people he trusted with his life. Holt's jaw tightened. Because it had been shared with a handful of people, which means the leak came from inside. That's what he thought. Right before her voice caught, she forced it forward anyway. Right before the second explosion. He saw it before I did, saw the trajectory, pushed me, threw himself between me and the blast radius because there wasn't time to do anything else. The room had gone completely silent, save for the low hum of the refrigerator somewhere in the kitchen and the distant muffled sound of a car passing outside. He didn't die instantly, Wren said, and this was the part she'd never said aloud to anyone, not even in the years of grief counseling her mother had insisted on, not even in the quiet nights alone at the cabin, when the memory came for her uninvited. He held on long enough to tell me. She stopped, started again. He told me to run, and I told him I wasn't leaving him, and he said she couldn't finish. Preacher, who'd been silent this entire time, leaned forward and placed a steady hand on the table, not touching her, just present, an anchor. Take your time, he said quietly. Wren breathed, in through the nose. 4 counts. Hold. 4 counts. Out, he said. Someone sold us out, Rennie. Find out who, not for revenge. For everyone who's still standing. Her voice broke completely on the last word. Those were the last words he ever said to me. And I've spent 8 years not knowing how to keep that promise, because every door I tried to open was already sealed. Holt closed his eyes. I sealed most of those doors, he admitted, voice raw with something that sounded, finally, like real guilt instead of practiced regret. I thought I was protecting you. Protecting his legacy. I never once considered that sealing the truth also sealed away the one thing he asked you to find. Then help me open it, Wren said. Now. Today. Because someone just tried to bury me publicly in front of a crowd of people who used to respect my father. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think whoever sold him out 8 years ago is still out there. And I think they're the same person who wants me silenced now. Holt looked at her for a long moment, then reached into the folder and pulled out a single page, a personnel file. Photograph clipped to the corner. This is where I have to tell you something difficult, he said. 8 years ago, when the leak was first investigated internally, we identified a suspect, a communications officer with access to the mission's location data. Lieutenant Commander Aaron Rutledge. You found him. Then why? Because the investigation ended before it should have. Holt's voice hardened. Rutledge was quietly discharged. Quietly. Because a public court-martial would have exposed the existence of the mission itself, your father's broken protocol, your presence on the operation, everything I'd worked to bury. So the Navy took the easy path, pushed him out under a general discharge. Let the story die. So he's the traitor. That's what I believed. For 8 years I believed that. Holt's expression darkened further. Until this morning, when your arrest hit my desk and I started pulling threads I hadn't touched in years. Rutledge has been dead for 3 years, Wren. Car accident. Nothing suspicious about it, as far as anyone investigated. Which means whoever orchestrated your arrest today, whoever is trying to silence you right now, isn't him, Wren finished. Isn't him, Holt confirmed. Which means we got it wrong 8 years ago. Rutledge wasn't the traitor. He was convenient. A name that fit the shape of the story we wanted to tell ourselves, so we could close the file and stop looking. The realization sat in the room like a physical presence, cold and unwelcome. If Rutledge wasn't the leak, Preacher said slowly, working the legal logic out loud the way he'd probably done in 100 courtrooms, then someone with access to that mission's classified location data is still active, still in the system, still positioned well enough, 8 years later, to orchestrate a federal arrest at a public ceremony with enough precision to make it look airtight. That takes resources, Wren said. Real resources. Someone with rank. Someone with reach into NCIS case assignment, into public affairs, into whatever machinery decided today was the day to arrest me in front of hundreds of witnesses. Holt nodded grimly. Someone who's been watching you. Waiting for a reason or manufacturing one. Why now, though? Wren pressed. 8 years of silence. 8 years of nothing. And then today, out of nowhere, they move against me. Why today? Holt hesitated. And something about that hesitation, the careful way he chose his next words, the way his eyes flicked briefly to Preacher before returning to Wren, told her the answer mattered more than he was ready to say out loud. There's a Senate Armed Services subcommittee hearing scheduled in 11 days, he said finally. Closed session, reviewing a pattern of classified operational failures over the past decade, including, under a still-sealed docket number, the mission that killed your father. Wren's chest tightened. You're saying someone's about to reopen the investigation. I'm saying I requested it be reopened 6 weeks ago, quietly, through channels I trusted. Holt's jaw worked, which means whoever the traitor is, whoever's been sitting comfortably for 8 years, believing the file was closed for good, just found out it isn't, and they're panicking. And I'm the loudest loose end, Wren said, the pieces clicking together with sickening clarity. The daughter who was actually there, the only living witness, who could testify to what really happened on that mountainside. If they discredit me now publicly, humiliatingly, before the hearing even convenes, then anything you say afterward gets dismissed as the ranting of a woman already exposed as a fraud, Preacher finished grimly. It's not just an arrest, Wren. It's preemptive character assassination. Textbook. The three of them sat with that for a long moment. Because it wasn't paranoia anymore. It wasn't grief twisting itself into conspiracy the way grief sometimes does when it needs somewhere to put its anger. It was a plan. Deliberate. Patient. Executed with precision by someone who understood exactly how institutions worked. Exactly which levers to pull. Exactly how to turn a grieving daughter into a punchline before she ever got the chance to be a witness. We need Rutledge's full file, Wren said, pulling herself upright, pulling the old discipline back over her like armor. Everyone who had clearance to that mission's location data. Everyone who benefited from the investigation ending early. Holt was already nodding. I can request it. Through channels that won't flag immediately. It'll take time. We don't have time. You said 11 days. Then we work fast, Preacher said. And carefully. Because if this person has the reach to orchestrate a federal arrest at a public ceremony, they have the reach to know the moment we start pulling files. That night, Wren didn't sleep. Not really. She lay on an unfamiliar guest bed in Holt's safe house, staring at a ceiling she didn't recognize, listening to the unfamiliar creaks of an unfamiliar house. And let the mountainside come back to her one more time, not because she wanted it to, but because some memories don't ask permission. She remembered the weight of her father's body as she tried to drag him toward the extraction point, knowing even then, in some animal part of her brain, that it was already too late. She remembered the radio crackling with static and half-words from a team scattered by an ambush none of them had seen coming. She remembered the medic who'd finally reached them, the one who'd photographed the scar on her collarbone for a report that would, 8 years later, flag a database and blow open a secret she'd spent nearly a decade guarding. And she thought about the promise. Someone sold us out, Rennie. Find out who. Not for revenge. For everyone who's still standing. 8 years. 8 years of silence. And she was no closer to keeping that promise than she'd been the night she made it. Until now. Because now she had a name to chase, even if it was the wrong one. A hearing date to race against. An admiral who'd finally chosen truth over comfort, and a lawyer who'd kept a promise to a dead man for 8 patient years without ever being asked to. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd had yesterday. The next morning, they moved carefully. Holt used a personal, off-network line to request Rutledge's full personnel file, not through official channels that might flag his interest, but through a retired colleague who owed him a favor decades old and asked no questions in return. Preacher, meanwhile, worked his own angle, quietly reaching out to a contact in military records who could pull the roster of everyone who'd held clearance to operation location data 8 years ago, cross-referenced against who was still active in the system today. Wren did the only thing she knew how to do while the two men worked their institutional channels. She went through her father's things. Not the box her mother had left behind. She'd been through that 100 times, memorized every letter, every faded photograph. She thought instead about the cabin, about a locked drawer in his old desk that she'd never had the key to, that she'd always assumed held nothing more than tax documents and old bills. She called the cabin's caretaker, a neighbor who checked on the property when she was away, and asked him to describe the drawer to her over the phone. Wood, brass lock. A keyhole shaped slightly differently than a standard desk lock. Break it open, she said. Please, I need to see what's inside. An hour later, the caretaker called back, his voice careful, the voice of a man who'd found something he didn't fully understand the weight of. There's a notebook, he said, handwritten, and a photograph. Guy in uniform, older, silver hair. There's writing on the back. Read it to me. A pause. Papers shuffling. It says if anything happens, ask him what really happened at the depot. He was there. He knows. Wren's blood ran cold. Who's the man in the photograph? Another pause, longer this time, the caretaker clearly squinting at details he had no context for. There's a name tag, he said finally. Says Combs. E. Combs. Wren wrote the name down with shaking hands, and something in her chest, some cold, patient part of her that had been waiting 8 years for exactly this settled into focus. Elias Combs. A name she'd never heard before in her life. And, she suspected, the first real thread in a conspiracy that had been hiding in plain sight for nearly a decade. She brought the name to Holt that afternoon, watching his face carefully as she said it, looking for any flicker of recognition, any tell that might suggest he already knew more than he was saying. Instead, his face went pale in a way that had nothing to do with guilt, and everything to do with genuine, dawning alarm. Elias Combs, he repeated slowly. I know that name. From where? He's a colonel. Active duty. Intelligence liaison, currently attached to Holt, stopped himself. some internal calculation flickering across his face. Currently attached to the subcommittee coordinating the closed hearing I requested 6 weeks ago. The room went very still. He's inside the investigation, Preacher said slowly. The exact investigation meant to reopen your father's case. He'd have access to everything. Timeline. Witness list. Which means he'd know, better than almost anyone, exactly how dangerous you are to whatever this conspiracy is protecting. And exactly how to stop me, Wren said, before I ever got the chance to testify. Holt was already reaching for his phone, his composure cracking for the first time since Wren had met him. Real fear showing through the practiced calm of 35 years of command. I need to make some calls, he said. Carefully, because if Combs finds out we're looking at him before we have proof. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to, because all three of them understood, in that moment, exactly what came next, for people who got too close to a truth someone else had killed to protect. That evening, as the sun dropped low and orange across the quiet residential street outside Holt's safe house, a car Wren didn't recognize idled at the end of the block for 11 minutes before pulling away. She noticed it from the upstairs window. Filed it away, the old instinct sharpening itself without being asked, cataloging. She didn't tell Holt. Not yet. Because some part of her, the part her father had trained, the part that had survived a mountainside 8 years ago, on nothing but breath control and stillness, understood that the hunted don't always announce what they've seen. Sometimes they wait. Sometimes they let the hunter believe he's still invisible, right up until the moment it matters most. And somewhere across the city, in an office with a closed door and a phone pressed carefully to his ear, Colonel Elias Combs listened to a voice on the other end, confirm what he'd feared since the moment the arrest hit the news cycle, and failed, spectacularly, to end the way he'd planned. She's not backing down, the voice said. She's digging, and she's got Holt and a lawyer both helping her. Combs closed his eyes, rubbed a hand across his face, the gesture of a man who'd spent 8 years believing a problem was buried, only to watch it claw its way back to the surface at the worst possible moment. Then we accelerate, he said quietly. We can't wait for the hearing to discredit her. We need her gone from the narrative entirely, before she talks to anyone else. A pause on the other end, careful, hesitant. Gone how? Combs didn't answer right away. Outside his office window, the base flag snapped in a rising evening wind, and somewhere beyond it, 3,000 miles from a mountainside that had haunted him for 8 years, a woman who looked exactly like the ghost he'd been running from, sat in a house he didn't yet know the address of, closer to the truth than she had ever been. However it needs to happen, he said finally. We're out of options that don't involve risk. He hung up, and outside, the car that had idled at the end of Holt's Street 11 minutes earlier turned back around, headlights cutting slowly through the gathering dark, and began patiently to circle back. They arrested her for faking as a SEAL until the Admiral saw her legendary scar, Part 3. The car came back at 11:14 p.m. Wren counted the minutes because counting was the only thing keeping her hands steady. 11:14. Headlights cutting low across the ceiling of the guest room, sliding, gone. Then back again 4 minutes later. Slower this time, which meant someone was mapping the house, which meant the 11 minutes from earlier hadn't been nothing. Hadn't been a neighbor lost, a delivery driver checking an address, any of the boring explanations she'd tried to talk herself into over dinner, while Holt made calls in the other room. And Preacher reviewed files at the kitchen table, like a man 20 years younger than his knees actually let him move. She didn't wake anyone. Not yet. She just watched. Because that was the first rule. Confirm before you alarm. Her father's voice, worn smooth from years of repetition, the kind of rule that lived in her bones now instead of her memory. The car idled at the corner for 90 seconds, then killed its lights. Wren was already moving. She crossed the hallway in bare feet, silent on the old wood floor, and knocked twice on Holt's door before letting herself in without waiting for an answer. Someone's watching the house. Holt sat up instantly. No grogginess, no confusion, the reflex of a man who'd spent 35 years sleeping light. How long? Second pass tonight. Lights just went dark at the corner. He was already pulling on a shirt. Get Whitfield up. They gathered in the kitchen with the lights off. 3 shapes at a table lit only by the pale spill of a street lamp through the blinds. Voices dropped to a register just above breath. Could be nothing, Preacher offered, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it any more than the other 2 did. Could be. Holt's jaw was tight. Or it could be Combs deciding waiting for the hearing isn't worth the risk anymore. Wren's stomach turned cold. You think he'd move against us directly? An active duty colonel. I think a man who orchestrated a federal arrest at a public memorial to discredit a grieving daughter has already shown me exactly how far he's willing to go. Holt's voice was flat, certain. The only question now is how far is far enough, which was the moment the porch light flickered. Not off, just flickered. The specific stutter of a bulb losing contact, or a shadow passing close enough to interrupt the beam. All 3 of them went still. Because stillness, Wren had learned a long time ago, was its own kind of language. The body understood danger faster than the mind could name it, and right now every cell in her body was screaming one word. Move. Back door. Holt breathed, already rising, already reaching for something from the kitchen drawer that turned out to be a sidearm he'd apparently kept close since the moment this whole thing started. Now quiet. Preacher grabbed the folder off the table. The one with Combs's name, the one with the photograph, the one piece of physical evidence connecting 8 years of silence to a name that could finally break it open, and clutched it against his chest like it weighed more than his own life. Which, in a sense, it did. They moved through the dark kitchen single file. Wren last because some old instinct wouldn't let her walk in front of the 2 men who'd only just, after 8 years, become the closest thing she had to family. The back door opened onto a narrow yard bordered by a low wooden fence, beyond which sat an alley that connected, eventually, to a side street 2 blocks over. Holt led them toward it, gun low, movements economical, in a way that told Wren this wasn't the first time in his career he'd needed to move a civilian through hostile territory in the dark. They were 3 steps from the fence when the front door of the house splintered inward. Not a knock, not a warning. Just wood cracking under sudden, deliberate force, and then the sound of boots on hardwood, fast and certain. The sound of men who'd done this before, and expected to find exactly what they'd come for. Except they wouldn't, because Holt had already gotten them out. Because 35 years of instinct had bought them 90 seconds. And 90 seconds, Wren understood with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its simplicity, was sometimes the entire margin between living and not. They cleared the fence, cut through the alley, emerged onto the side street, where Holt's second car, a nondescript gray sedan he'd apparently parked there hours earlier, some quiet contingency none of them had discussed out loud, sat waiting under a dead street lamp. You had an exit plan, Wren said, breathless, sliding into the back seat as Preacher folded himself in beside her, the folder still clutched tight. I had 35 years of learning that plans without exits get people killed. Holt started the engine, pulled away from the curb without headlights until they'd cleared 2 full blocks. I'm sorry I didn't tell you. Some habits I don't unlearn just because the war's supposed to be over. Behind them, distant now, a shout carried faintly on the night air. Frustrated. Empty-handed. Wren allowed herself exactly 3 seconds to feel the relief. Then her mind was already moving forward. Because relief was a luxury for people who weren't still being hunted. And she wasn't done being hunted yet, not by a long stretch. They drove for 40 minutes without speaking. Holt taking a route that doubled back twice, cut through a gas station parking lot, merged onto a highway only to exit 1 ramp later, every maneuver deliberate. Every maneuver designed to shake a tail that might or might not have existed. By the time they pulled into the gravel lot of a roadside motel on the edge of nowhere, Wren's hands had finally stopped shaking. Mostly. We can't go back to any property connected to my name, Holt said, killing the engine, staring straight ahead at the flickering neon sign. Or yours. Or Whitfield's. Whoever sent those men knows exactly who we are, and exactly where we sleep. So what do we do? Wren asked. Hide in a motel until the hearing. No. Holt turned to look at her, and something in his face had hardened into a resolve she hadn't seen from him yet. Not grief, not guilt. Something closer to the man he must have been decades ago, before rank and paperwork had worn the edges off him. We stopped playing defense. We go after Combs directly. Because the moment he sent men through that door, he told us something important. What? He's scared enough to break protocol himself, which means he doesn't have as much time or as much control as he wants us to believe, which means there's a crack somewhere. And cracks are how you bring down men like him. Room 114 smelled like cigarettes from decades before the smoking ban, and the air conditioner rattled like it was fighting for its life. But it had 4 walls, a locked door, and most importantly, no connection to any of their real names, paid for in cash by Preacher with an ease that suggested this wasn't the first time in his life he'd needed a room nobody could trace. They spread the folder's contents across the bed. Photographs, personnel records, the single damning photograph of Elias Combs that Wren's father had hidden away for reasons that were only now becoming clear. "Tell me everything you know about him," Wren said. Combs. Not just his rank. Everything. Holt exhaled slowly, pulling a chair up to the bed. Colonel Elias Combs, intelligence liaison, 26 years of service, most of it in roles that don't show up on a standard resume. Married. 1 daughter, grown now. Mid-20s, I believe. Reputation as a careful man. Methodical. The kind of officer who doesn't make mistakes because he spent his entire career making sure he never has to. Doesn't sound like a man who panics and sends thugs through a door, Preacher observed. No, Holt agreed slowly. It doesn't. Which bothers me more than if he did. Wren stared down at the photograph, at the careful, composed face of a man she'd never met, who had somehow become the center of a gravity that had already killed her father, and was now trying to erase her too. Something's controlling him, she said, the thought arriving fully formed. The way true things sometimes did in the middle of exhaustion when the mind stopped trying so hard to be clever. A man that careful doesn't take this kind of risk unless something bigger is forcing his hand. Holt's eyes sharpened. Go on. 8 years ago, someone sold my father's location to people who wanted his team dead. That takes access. Real access. Enough to move classified coordinates outside official channels without immediate detection. Wren's mind was working now, the old training kicking in, the pattern recognition her father had drilled into her on 100 cold mornings on 100 shooting ranges. But it also takes motive. And careful men like you're describing don't sell out their own country for money. Not usually. They do it because someone found a way to make them. Preacher leaned forward. Blackmail. Or coercion. Or something worse. Wren looked up. If we want to understand why Combs is willing to break protocol now, we need to understand what forced him to break it 8 years ago. It took them 2 days to find the thread, working in careful bursts from burner phones and library computers, avoiding anything that could be traced back to any of their real identities. The thread, when they found it, was a daughter. Combs's daughter, Melissa Combs, 26, a graduate student who had, 8.5 years ago, spent a semester studying abroad in a region that overlapped, disturbingly, with the geopolitical actors who had benefited most from the ambush that killed Wren's father. She was detained, Preacher said, reading from a printout he'd pulled through a contact who owed him a decade-old favor. 8 years ago, briefly, officially released after 48 hours, on what the report calls an administrative visa error. He looked up, grim. 48 hours is a long time to hold an American citizen for a visa error. Long enough to make a father do almost anything to get his daughter home safe. Wren felt something cold settle over her. The specific chill of understanding a monster wasn't quite a monster, after all, just a man who'd been given an impossible choice and had chosen, in a moment of desperate love, to make the wrong one. They used her, Wren said quietly, to get to him. It fits the pattern, Holt said. Foreign intelligence services have run this play for decades. Find leverage over a family member. Apply pressure, extract cooperation under threat of harm to the person you love most. His voice had gone hollow. If Combs believed his daughter's life depended on providing a single piece of classified data, one time, Just once I understand. God help me. I understand exactly how a father makes that choice. That doesn't excuse what happened to mine, Wren said, sharper than she meant to, the old grief flaring hot and sudden. No, Holt agreed immediately. It doesn't. Nothing excuses it. But it explains why a careful man broke every rule in his career 8 years ago. And it explains why he's breaking them again now. Because if this ever comes to light, if the Senate subcommittee ever connects his name to that leak, he doesn't just lose his career. He loses everything. His daughter learns what her captivity cost. His wife learns her husband is a traitor. His entire life, built on decades of careful discipline, collapses into a single, unforgivable night he spent 8 years trying to bury. Wren stared at the photograph of Elias Combs's careful, composed face and felt something complicated twist inside her chest. Not forgiveness, she wasn't there, might never be there, but understanding, cold and clear and undeniable. Because a monster was easy to hate. A frightened father protecting his daughter was something else entirely. Something that made the whole tragedy feel less like a villain's plot and more like a chain of ordinary people making impossible choices that had, link by link, led to a mountainside and a dead seal and a scar that wouldn't fade. It doesn't change what we have to do, she said finally. No, Holt agreed, it doesn't. But it changes how we do it. Combs isn't some mastermind enjoying his power. He's a cornered man protecting the last thing he has left. Cornered men are dangerous in ways calculated men aren't. They don't think clearly. They don't negotiate. They fight, Preacher said quietly. They fight, Holt confirmed. Which means whatever we do next, we do it carefully. Because a cornered animal doesn't care about collateral damage anymore. He only cares about survival. They spent the next 3 days building a case they could survive presenting. Holt reached out to a colleague on the Senate subcommittee, someone he'd trusted for 20 years, someone insulated enough from the base's internal politics to receive information without it immediately leaking back to Combs. Preacher drafted a sworn statement meticulous in its legal precision, laying out everything Wren had told them about the mountainside, cross-referenced against the personnel records, the redacted incident report, the photograph her father had hidden for 8 years, with a message that had, finally, led them somewhere. Wren, for her part, did something she hadn't expected to do. She wrote a letter, not for the hearing, not for the record, a letter to her father, the kind of letter grief counselors always suggested and she'd always refused, because writing to a dead man had felt, for 8 years, like performing sadness instead of living inside it. But sitting in a motel room with a rattling air conditioner and a folder full of evidence that might finally let her keep the promise he'd asked of her with his last breath, she found she had things to say after all. I found him, Dad, she wrote. Not the way you meant, maybe. Not a clean answer. Just a scared man who made a terrible choice for a reason I almost understand. I don't know if that makes it better or worse. I don't know if finding him is the same as finishing what you asked me to do. But I'm trying. I'm still trying. I haven't stopped since the second they put handcuffs on me at your memorial, which is a sentence I never thought I'd write. But here we are. I miss you every single day. I miss the mornings on the range. I miss the way you'd go quiet before a difficult shot, like the whole world had to hold still for you to take it. I'm holding still now, Dad, waiting for my shot. I hope I don't miss. She folded the letter and put it in her jacket pocket, next to the trident, and didn't cry, because crying was a luxury for later, for after, for whenever this was finally, actually over. On the 4th night, Holt's contact on the subcommittee called with news that changed everything. They're moving the hearing up, he said, voice tight with urgency even through the burner phone's tinny speaker. Someone tipped them off that evidence exists connecting an active duty officer to a compromised operation 8 years ago. They want to convene tomorrow morning. Closed session. But someone leaked the tip, Marcus, and I don't think it was one of us. Holt's face went white. Combs knows we're close. He knows something, the contact confirmed, which means if you have a witness, you need her there tomorrow morning, prepared to testify. Because if Combs gets even 12 hours of warning before that hearing, evidence has a way of disappearing. So do witnesses sometimes, if you'll forgive me for saying it plainly. The line went dead. Wren looked at Holt, at Preacher, at the folder full of evidence that had taken 8 years and 3 desperate people to assemble. "Then we go tonight," she said. "We get ahead of him instead of running from him." Wren Preacher started, concern etched across his weathered face. "No." Her voice came out steadier than she felt, but steady enough to mean it. "I've spent 8 years being careful, being quiet, protecting a secret that was never mine to protect alone. I'm done running from a man who spent 8 years running from what he did to my father." She looked between them, jaw set, the old discipline settling over her like armor. "We go to him. Tonight. On our terms. Before he has the chance to come for us again." Holt studied her for a long moment, then nodded, slow and grave. "Your father would be proud of you right now," he said quietly. "Terrified, but proud. He'd probably tell me I'm being reckless." "He'd tell you that," Holt agreed, "right before he did the exact same thing himself." They found Combs's private residence through records Holt still had access to, a modest colonial-style house on a quiet street, not unlike the one they'd fled 2 nights earlier, the kind of ordinary suburban address that made the whole situation feel almost absurdly domestic for something that had already cost a man his life. They didn't plan to break in, didn't plan a confrontation in the shadows. They parked across the street, in full view, headlights visible, and Holt made a single phone call to a number he'd pulled from Combs's service file, a personal line, one that hadn't changed in years. "Elias," Holt said when the line connected, his voice flat and formal, command voice, the voice of a man who'd outranked this conversation's other participant for 2 decades. "It's Marcus Holt. I'm parked outside your house. I have Wren Vance with me. And I have enough evidence to end your career the moment the sun comes up, whether you talk to me tonight or not." A long silence on the other end. Then, finally, a voice tired, hollow, the voice of a man who'd been waiting 8 years for a phone call exactly like this one, and had somehow convinced himself every single day that it would never actually come. "Come inside," Combs said quietly. "Just her. And you. No one else." "That's not how this works," Holt said. "It's the only way it works tonight," Combs replied. "You want your evidence to matter tomorrow. I want to say what I have to say without an audience. Those 2 things can happen at the same time, Marcus, if you'll let them." Holt looked at Wren, a question in his eyes. She nodded, jaw tight, the trident and the letter both sitting heavy against her chest inside her jacket. "Preacher stays with the car," she said, "with the folder. If anything happens to us, he drives straight to the subcommittee with everything we have." Preacher's face had gone pale, old fear surfacing beneath decades of courtroom composure. "Wren, it's the only way," she said, echoing Combs's own words back at him without quite meaning to. "I've spent 8 years being careful. I'm done." The house was quiet inside. Too quiet, the particular silence of a home where something has already, irreversibly, changed. Combs met them in a living room, decorated with the careful, unremarkable taste of a family that had spent decades of moving between postings. Photographs on the mantel of a smiling young woman at various ages, birthdays, graduations, a study abroad photo in front of a foreign monument that made Wren's chest tighten the moment she recognized the region. Combs himself looked smaller than his photograph. Older, a man who'd been carrying something heavy for so long that the weight had finally started to show in his posture, in the deep lines carved into his face, in hands that trembled slightly as he gestured for them to sit. "I know why you're here," he said, before either of them could speak. "I've known this night was coming for 8 years. I think some part of me is relieved it's finally arrived." Wren stayed standing. "Tell me what happened." Combs closed his eyes. "My daughter, Melissa, she was studying abroad, doing research for her thesis, completely innocent, completely uninvolved in anything that mattered to anyone. She was detained. 48 hours that felt like 48 years. When they released her, a man visited me, told me she'd made friends in the wrong places, told me they had photographs, recordings, enough to destroy her academic career, her future, everything she'd worked for, unless I helped them with a small one-time favor. A location," Wren said flatly. "A single set of coordinates. That's what they told me. One time. No one gets hurt, they said. Just intelligence sharing between parties who already know most of it anyway. His voice cracked. I believed them. God forgive me. I believed them because I needed to believe them. Because the alternative was watching my daughter's entire life get destroyed for something she never even understood she'd stumbled into. People died, Ren said, her voice shaking now. 8 years of grief. Finally finding a target that could hear it. My father died. Because of coordinates you handed over to protect your daughter. I know. Combs's voice broke completely. I've known every single day for 8 years. I've stood at memorial walls and read his name and felt something inside me die a little more each time. Because I knew what my silence cost. And I let it happen anyway, because I couldn't watch my little girl's life get taken apart for something that wasn't even her fault. The room fell into a silence so heavy it felt physical, pressing down on all three of them like weight. Why the arrest? Holt asked finally, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Why go after her now, 8 years later, when you'd already gotten away with it? Because the hearing, Combs said, defeated now, the last of his composure crumbling entirely. 6 weeks ago, word started moving through channels that someone was reopening the investigation into that operation. I panicked. I've spent 8 years building walls around this secret, and I watched them start to crack. And I did the only thing I knew how to do. I found a way to discredit the one person whose testimony could bring the whole thing down before it ever reached a hearing room. By destroying my reputation, Ren said, disgust and grief tangled together in her voice. By making me a punchline instead of a witness. Yes, Combs admitted. God help me, yes. It was cowardly and it was wrong, and I've hated myself every hour since I gave the order. But I was trying to protect. Your daughter, Ren finished, bitter. Same as before. Always the same reason. I know it doesn't make it right, Combs said quietly. I know nothing I say tonight undoes 8 years or brings your father back, or erases what I let happen to protect the person I love most in this world. He looked up, and for the first time, his eyes met Ren's directly, raw and broken, and finally, after 8 years, honest. But I'll testify tomorrow. Everything. My daughter's detention, the coercion, the coordinates I handed over, the order I gave to have you arrested. I'll say all of it, under oath, no matter what it costs me, because I think I've been protecting the wrong person this entire time. I think it's time I finally protect the truth instead. Ren stared at him for a long, silent moment, feeling something complicated shift inside her chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever, but something adjacent to it. Something that understood, even through the grief, that the world was rarely as simple as heroes and villains, and that sometimes the people who did the most damage were simply ordinary people who'd been backed into an impossible corner and chosen, in a single moment of terror, the wrong door. Tomorrow morning, she said finally, you testify. Everything. And if you flinch, if you soften a single detail to protect yourself, I will make sure the entire country knows exactly what you did and exactly why you did it. I understand, Combs said quietly. Good. Ren turned toward the door, Holt falling into step beside her, the weight in her chest shifting from 8 years of unanswered grief into something that felt dangerously like the beginning of closure. They were 3 steps from the door when it happened. The window shattered first. Not from outside, from a projectile thrown through it, small and metallic, rolling across the hardwood floor, with a sound that every person in that room recognized instantly, viscerally, the specific dread reserved for objects that shouldn't be rolling across anyone's living room floor. Down. Holt's voice, command voice, all instinct now, no hesitation. The flashbang detonated with a concussion that swallowed every other sound in the world. Light and noise exploding through the room in a single violent instant that left Ren's ears ringing and her vision swimming with white afterimages. Which meant she almost didn't hear the front door crash open. Which meant she almost didn't see the shapes moving through the smoke and ringing silence. 3 men, tactical gear, moving with the coordinated efficiency of people who did this professionally, who had clearly been sent to make sure Combs never made it to tomorrow's hearing at all. because a dead colonel couldn't testify against himself. Ren's training took over before her conscious mind caught up. She rolled behind an overturned couch, ears still ringing, vision still fractured with light, and heard dimly, through the concussion's aftermath, Holt's voice shouting something she couldn't fully parse. Combs was already moving toward the hallway, reaching for something, a weapon, she realized. Some part of her mind cataloging details even through the chaos. He kept a weapon close. A man who'd spent 8 years anticipating exactly this kind of night. The first shot cracked through the ringing silence like a physical blow. Ren didn't see who fired it. She only saw Combs stagger, catch himself against the doorframe, blood already blooming dark across his shoulder. "Go!" he shouted, voice raw, shoving himself upright despite the wound, positioning his body between the advancing shapes and the two people he'd spent the last 10 minutes, finally, belatedly, trying to protect instead of destroy. "Get her out!" Holt grabbed Ren's arm, hauling her toward the shattered window, toward an exit that hadn't been breached yet. Except she wasn't moving fast enough. Except her mind was still fractured by the concussion, still trying to process the sudden violence, still trying to understand how a night that had begun with a confession had transformed, in the space of 30 seconds, into a firefight in a suburban living room. A second shot rang out, then a third, and through the smoke and the ringing and the chaos, Ren saw Combs go down, fully now, collapsing against the hallway wall, his own weapon still gripped in a hand that no longer had the strength to raise it. "Move!" Holt's voice again, desperate now, dragging her bodily toward the window. They cleared it together, glass crunching underfoot, tumbling out into the cold night air of a suburban backyard that felt, in that moment, like the only safe place left in the entire world. Except it wasn't. Because the men inside weren't finished. Because somewhere behind them, in the wreckage of a living room that had, minutes earlier, held a broken man's confession, footsteps were already moving toward the same window they'd just escaped through. They ran. Through the backyard, over a low fence, into a neighbor's property lit only by a single porch light and the distant wash of a street lamp. Ren's lungs burned, her ears still ringing, every sense she had screaming at a pitch that made rational thought almost impossible. The car, Holt gasped, pulling her toward the street where Preacher waited, engine already running because he'd heard the flashbang from 2 blocks away and understood, instantly, that everything had just gone catastrophically wrong. They reached the sedan seconds before the pursuers reached the street, 3 shapes emerging from the shadows of the house they'd fled, weapons raised, silhouetted against the porch light, like something out of a nightmare Ren had spent 8 years trying not to have. "Drive!" Holt shouted, throwing himself and Ren into the back seat, as Preacher's foot hit the gas before the doors had even fully closed. The car lurched forward. A shot cracked somewhere behind them, wide, missing, the pursuers already falling back rather than risk a prolonged chase through a residential neighborhood full of witnesses, and 911 calls already being dialed by neighbors, woken by gunfire. They sped 3 blocks before Holt finally let himself breathe. "Combs," Ren said, voice shaking, adrenaline finally starting to crack under the weight of what she'd just witnessed. "He's still in there. He's hurt. We have to get you somewhere safe," Holt said, though his own voice betrayed the same conflict tearing through Ren's chest. "Preacher, call it in. Anonymous tip. Shots fired, ambulance needed, that address. We can't be the ones who show up at the scene, not with a compromised evidence chain and 3 federal charges hanging over Ren's head that haven't been cleared yet." Preacher was already dialing, hands steady despite everything, decades of legal discipline holding under pressure that would have broken most men half his age. Ren stared out the window at the passing streetlights, chest heaving, mind racing through the fragments of what had just happened. Combs, stepping between her and the gunfire, a man who'd ordered her arrest, who'd spent 8 years complicit in her father's death, throwing himself into danger the moment it mattered. The moment protecting her actually cost him something real. Because maybe redemption didn't erase what came before it, except maybe it mattered anyway. Maybe it mattered that in the final moment, when it counted most, he'd chosen to protect instead of destroy. She didn't know what to do with that. Didn't know how to hold grief and grudging respect in the same chest at the same time. So she just breathed. In through the nose. 4 counts. Hold. Out through the mouth. And tried to survive the next few hours long enough to find out if any of it had mattered at all. They didn't return to the motel. Couldn't. Not after tonight. Not with professional operators clearly willing to use lethal force to keep this secret buried. Instead, Holt drove them to a location he'd apparently kept in reserve for exactly this kind of catastrophic contingency, a small private airfield 40 minutes outside the city, owned by another retired officer who asked no questions and offered, without hesitation, the use of a hangar office with a cot, a bathroom, and a door that locked. "We wait here until dawn," Holt said, exhaustion finally visible on his face, the composed Admiral cracking under the weight of a night that had gone catastrophically sideways. "Then we go straight to the hearing. No detours, no more risks." "And Combs?" Wren asked. Holt's jaw tightened. The tip preacher called in should have gotten him medical attention. Whether he survives long enough to testify. He stopped himself, shook his head. "I don't know, Wren. I genuinely don't know." Preacher, who'd been quiet since the phone call, finally spoke, voice tight with something that sounded almost like physical pain. "We have his confession. Recorded." Both Holt and Wren turned to him, startled. Preacher pulled a small device from his jacket pocket, a digital recorder, the kind lawyers carried into depositions, its small red light still blinking, still active. "I turned it on the moment we walked in," he admitted. "Standard practice. I've done it in 100 client meetings. Never told either of you because I didn't want you performing for a recording instead of speaking honestly." He set it on the table between them, hands trembling slightly, whether from adrenaline or age or the sheer weight of what the device now contained. "Every word Combs said tonight is on here. His daughter's detention, the coercion, the coordinates, the order to arrest Wren." His voice cracked. "It's all here. Even if he doesn't survive to testify himself, this recording does the testifying for him." Wren stared at the small device like it might disappear if she looked away. 8 years. 8 years of silence, of grief flattened into 4 cold words on a granite wall, of carrying a promise she hadn't known how to keep. And now, sitting on a folding table in a private hangar office at 4 in the morning, the truth existed. Recorded. Undeniable. She reached out and touched the small recorder gently, almost reverently, the way you'd touch something sacred. "Dad," she whispered so quietly the other 2 men in the room barely heard it. "I found it. I actually found it." The hearing convened at 9 the following morning in a secure federal building. Closed session, no press, no public gallery, just a small subcommittee of senators, a handful of aides with appropriate clearance, and 3 people who'd spent the last 5 days fighting to reach this room alive. Wren sat at the witness table with her father's trident pinned openly to her jacket for the first time in 8 years, no longer hidden, no longer a secret she had to carry alone. The subcommittee chair, an older senator with a weathered face and a voice that carried decades of gravitas, looked at her with an expression Wren couldn't quite read. "Miss Vance," he said, "we understand you have testimony regarding a compromised operation 8 years ago, and regarding a recent arrest that appears connected to efforts to prevent that testimony from ever reaching this room." "Yes, sir. Before we begin, I should inform you that Colonel Elias Combs was transported to a military hospital early this morning, following a shooting incident at his residence. He is currently in stable condition." The senator's eyes flicked briefly toward a note in front of him. "He has requested, through his attorney, that a sworn statement be entered into this record on his behalf, corroborating your account." Something in Wren's chest loosened slightly. Not relief, exactly. Something quieter. The specific, complicated feeling of learning that a man capable of terrible things had also, in his final moment of choice, tried to do one right thing. "Then let's begin," the senator said. "Miss Vance, tell us what happened on that mountainside 8 years ago." She told them everything. The training. The mission she was never supposed to be part of. Her father's impossible choice. made in a single desperate moment, to protect her rather than expose her. The ambush that should never have been possible. Her father's last words carried for 8 years like a stone in her chest. The years of silence that followed, sealed by an NDA she'd signed as a terrified 19-year-old who understood almost nothing of what she was agreeing to. She told them about the arrest, about the calculated cruelty of being handcuffed at her own father's memorial, in front of hundreds of people who'd once respected his legacy, transformed in a single humiliating moment into a punchline instead of a grieving daughter. She told them about Admiral Holt's courage in reopening a case he could have easily left buried, about Preacher's quiet, decades-old promise to a friend who never got to see it kept, about a recording made in a suburban living room hours before gunfire had nearly ended all their lives. By the time she finished, the room had gone completely, reverently silent. The senator, who'd been chairing the hearing, removed his glasses, rubbed his eyes, and set them back on his face with the careful deliberation of a man who needed a moment to compose himself before speaking again. "Miss Vance," he said finally, "on behalf of this committee, I want to apologize. Not just for the arrest, though that alone deserves apology enough. For 8 years of silence that should never have been allowed to stand. For a system that protected careers and reputations at the expense of a family's right to know the truth about how their loved one died." He paused. "Your father's actions on that mountainside broke protocol. There's no way around that fact, and it will be noted in the official record. But his actions also saved his daughter's life at the cost of his own, and I think that deserves to be remembered as an act of extraordinary courage, not buried as an embarrassing footnote in a classified file." Wren felt tears finally break free. 8 years of carefully guarded grief finally finding permission to surface in a room full of strangers, who for the first time actually understood the full weight of what she'd been carrying. "Thank you," she managed. "The committee will move to declassify the relevant portions of this operation's record." The senator continued, "Pending standard security review. Your father's death will be officially amended to reflect the true circumstances, not merely killed in the line of duty, but recognized appropriately for the act of heroism it actually was." He glanced toward Holt. "And Admiral, given your role in bringing this forward, despite significant personal and professional risk, this committee will also formally recommend that any administrative consequences related to the original cover-up be weighed against the courage it took to finally correct it." Holt nodded, throat visibly tight. "Thank you, Senator. Though I'd ask the committee to remember the courage in this room belongs to her." He gestured toward Wren. "I buried a truth for 8 years out of what I told myself was mercy. She's the one who had the courage to let it come back into the light, even when that light nearly got her killed." The aftermath took weeks to fully unfold. The slow, grinding machinery of federal bureaucracy working through declassification reviews, formal record amendments, and a quiet but decisive collapse of the stolen valor charges that had started the entire ordeal. Wren learned, through updates relayed by Preacher, that Elias Combs had survived his injuries, had testified fully and without reservation from his hospital bed, and would face a court-martial for his role in the original breach. A court-martial that would, at his own insistence, be conducted with full transparency, rather than the quiet burial that had protected him 8 years earlier. His daughter, Melissa, had visited Wren once, unannounced, standing awkwardly on the porch of the cabin by the lake with an expression caught somewhere between shame and desperate hope. "I didn't know," she'd said, voice shaking. "I didn't know any of this happened because of me. I'm so sorry. I don't know how sorry is supposed to be enough for something like this." Wren had looked at her for a long moment, this young woman, barely younger than herself, who'd been an unwitting pawn in a tragedy that had claimed a father's life 8 years before either of them fully understood what was happening. "It's not your fault," Wren had said finally, and meant it, the words settling something complicated and difficult inside her own chest. "Your father made a choice under impossible pressure. So did mine. Neither of you chose what happened. You both just had to live with it." Melissa had cried on the porch, and Wren had let her, understanding, in a way she hadn't expected to. That grief sometimes connected people in strange and unwilling ways, binding together families that circumstance had never intended to meet. The new memorial ceremony was scheduled for 6 weeks later, at the same base, the same granite wall, the same rows of folding chairs, except this time, everything was different. This time, Wren stood at the podium instead of the back row. This time, the crowd that gathered wasn't full of strangers watching a grieving daughter with suspicion. It was full of people who now understood exactly what Senior Chief Daniel Vance had sacrificed, exactly what his daughter had endured to bring that sacrifice into the light. Admiral Holt stood beside her, dress uniform immaculate. Decades of quiet guilt finally settled into something that looked, for the first time since Wren had met him, like peace. 8 years ago, the officer at the podium said, voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd, this base lost Senior Chief Daniel Vance under circumstances that were, for far too long, misrepresented and incompletely honored. Today, with the declassification of operation records and the full acknowledgement of the courage it took to reveal them, we correct that record. He turned toward the granite wall, where a small ceremony crew stood ready beside Daniel Vance's name. Effective today, Senior Chief Vance's record will reflect not merely that he was killed in the line of duty, but that he gave his life protecting a civilian under his direct care, at extraordinary personal risk, in direct violation of protocol he understood completely and chose to break anyway, because the alternative was unacceptable to him. The officer's voice softened slightly. This is the truest definition of heroism this Navy knows. And it took his daughter's courage 8 years later to make sure the world finally understood it. The crowd was silent, then, slowly, began to applaud not the polite, obligatory applause of ceremony, but something warmer, something that carried real weight and real feeling across the assembled rows of veterans and families. Wren felt tears sliding freely down her face, and for the first time in 8 years, she didn't try to stop them. After the formal ceremony ended, after the crowd had thinned, and the folding chairs sat empty in the afternoon sun, Admiral Holt approached Wren at the edge of the granite wall, where she stood alone in front of her father's name, fingers tracing the newly amended inscription. "I have something for you," he said quietly. He held out a small velvet box different from the one that had held her father's original trident. Newer, official, the kind issued through proper channels rather than passed hand to hand in a quiet moment of paternal love. Wren opened it with trembling fingers. Inside sat a trident of her own. "I don't understand," she said. "The committee reviewed everything," Holt said. "Your training, your actions on that mountainside, incomplete as your involvement was. Your courage over these past weeks, uncovering a truth that powerful people wanted buried at any cost." He paused. "This isn't a combat qualification, Wren. I want to be honest with you about that. You never completed Bud SS. You never served formally. This is something different, a civilian commendation, the highest one this Navy has, awarded for extraordinary courage in service of truth and justice, in your father's name and your own." Wren stared at the trident. Gold and gleaming and entirely her own, no longer borrowed from a dead man's memory, but earned through 8 years of silence finally broken. "Would you do the honors?" she asked quietly, of pinning it. Holt's eyes glistened, 35 years of naval composure finally fully cracking. "It would be the greatest honor of my career." He pinned it to her jacket with careful, steady hands, right where her father's trident had rested in secret for 8 long years, except now it sat in the open, visible. No longer a secret anyone needed to hide. "Your father would be so proud of you," Holt said, voice thick with emotion. "Not for the mission 8 years ago. Not for surviving it. For everything you did after. For refusing to stay silent, even when silence would have been so much easier." Wren looked past him, toward the wall, toward her father's name gleaming freshly amended in the afternoon light. "I kept my promise," she said softly. "More to the wall than to Holt. I found out who sold you out, Dad. I found out why. And I made sure everyone still standing finally knows the truth." The wind moved gently across the ceremony grounds, carrying the faint scent of salt from the nearby harbor, and for the first time in 8 years, Wren Vance felt something settle inside her chest that felt unmistakably like peace. Preacher found her an hour later, sitting alone on a bench overlooking the harbor, the new trident catching the late afternoon light. "You did good, kid," he said, easing himself down beside her with the careful movements of a man whose knees had opinions about long ceremonies. "Your old man would have been insufferable about how proud he was. Probably would have bought a round for the entire base." Wren laughed, the sound surprising her, the first real laugh she'd allowed herself in longer than she could remember. "He wasn't much of a drinker." "No," Preacher agreed, smiling. "But he would have made an exception today." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching boats move slowly across the harbor, watching the sun begin its long orange descent toward the water. "What happens now?" Wren asked finally. Preacher considered the question seriously, the way he considered everything. "Now you get to decide what kind of life you want to build. Not the one grief built for you. Not the one silence built for you. Something you choose for yourself, with both eyes open. I don't know what that looks like yet." "Nobody ever does," Preacher said gently. "That's the whole terrifying, beautiful point of getting a second chance." He paused, glancing sideways at her with something that looked almost like mischief. "Though I hear the Navy's got a growing list of consulting roles for people with exactly your particular set of talents. Admiral Holt may have mentioned it. Repeatedly, like a man who's already decided the answer before he's finished asking the question." Wren smiled, small and genuine, looking out at the water, at the harbor, at a horizon that felt, for the first time in 8 years, wide open instead of closed. "Maybe," she said softly. "Someday. Not today." Today was for grief finally allowed to breathe, for truth finally spoken out loud, for a father's name freshly amended on a granite wall, gleaming honest in the late afternoon sun. But someday, because some promises, once kept, had a way of opening doors to entirely new ones. And Wren Vance, for the first time in 8 long years, finally felt ready to walk through whatever came next. 6 months later, and the lake had changed color with the season. Summer green gone amber. The water colder now, sharper. The kind of cold that woke something honest in a person's chest the moment they stepped into it. Wren didn't step into it that morning. She stood at the end of the dock instead, rifle steady against her shoulder, breath slow, and let 3 months of quiet finally settle all the way into her bones. Because quiet meant something different now. Before, quiet had been a wall, a place to hide a secret so heavy it had started reshaping the person carrying it. Now quiet was just quiet. Morning air, cold water, a rifle that no longer felt like the only language she had left. She fired once. The can spun off the fence post exactly the way it always had. Some things didn't change. Which, she was learning, wasn't always a bad thing. The cabin looked different too, though nothing about the cedar siding or the wood stove had actually moved. What had changed sat on the mantel now, next to her father's photograph, angled the same way toward the morning light. A second photograph, newer, taken at the amended memorial ceremony 6 months earlier. Wren in dress clothes, trident gleaming on her jacket, Admiral Holt beside her with an expression that had finally, after 8 years, settled into something like peace instead of grief. She looked at both photographs every morning now. Father. Then the day she'd finally kept her promise to him. 2 bookends to a story that had taken 8 years to tell honestly. Her phone rang while she was pouring coffee she actually planned to finish this time. Preacher's name on the screen. She smiled before she even answered. "You're supposed to be retired," she said instead of hello. "I am retired." Preacher's voice came back, warm and a little tired. The particular tired of a man who'd spent the last 6 months handling more legal paperwork than his retirement had ever intended to include. Retired men are allowed to check on people they care about. It's in the rule book somewhere. "How's the court-martial?" A pause. "Heavier now. Concluded yesterday, actually. I was going to call you either way, but I wanted to wait until it was final before I said anything." Wren set her coffee down. "Tell me." Combs pled guilty. To everything. No plea bargain, no reduced charges, no attempt to soften the record. Preacher's voice carried something complicated in it, not approval. Exactly, but a kind of grim respect. Dishonorable discharge. Loss of pension. 5 years, suspended to probation given his medical condition, and his full cooperation with the subcommittee's investigation. The judge specifically noted his voluntary testimony and his actions the night of the shooting as mitigating factors. Wren stood quietly for a long moment, feeling the weight of that news settle somewhere complicated in her chest. Not triumph. She'd expected triumph. Once, back when Combs had been nothing but a name on a photograph in a locked drawer. What she felt instead was something quieter, sadder. The particular ache of watching an ordinary flawed man finally pay in full for a single terrible choice he'd spent 8 years trying to outrun. And his daughter, she asked. Melissa finished her graduate program. Wrote to the judge, actually, during sentencing. Didn't ask for leniency. Just told the truth about how the whole thing happened, start to finish, from her side of it. Preacher's voice softened. I think she's trying to carry some of the weight her father's been carrying alone for 8 years. Trying to make sure nobody ever has to inherit a secret like that again. Wren thought of the young woman standing awkwardly on her porch 6 months earlier, shame and desperate hope tangled together in her face. Good, she said quietly. That's good. The second call came an hour later, and this one she'd been half expecting for weeks. Admiral Holt, she answered, a small smile already tugging at her mouth. You always answer like you already know it's me. Holt's voice came back, warm with something that sounded, these days, almost like genuine affection instead of formal duty. Makes an old man feel predictable. You are predictable. You call every Tuesday at 9 sharp. It's very reassuring, actually. Then I won't apologize for it. A pause, and Wren could practically hear him settling into something more serious. I have a proposal for you. Same one I've mentioned before. I'm mentioning it again because the offer's become official this week, and I thought you deserved to hear it properly instead of me dancing around it every Tuesday like a nervous schoolboy. Wren leaned against the kitchen counter, coffee finally cooling in her hand. I'm listening. The Navy's building a civilian advisory program, working alongside intelligence and special operations units on cases involving compromised operations, cold cases, exactly the kind of institutional blind spots that let your father's death get buried for 8 years in the first place. Holt's voice carried real conviction now, the practiced formality falling away into something closer to a man talking about work he genuinely believed mattered. We need people who understand both sides of it, the tactical training and the cost of silence. You're uniquely qualified for both, Wren, whether the Navy officially trained you for it or not. That's a big ask. It's an enormous ask, Holt agreed. Which is exactly why I'm not asking you to answer today. I'm asking you to think about it. Really think about it. No pressure, no deadline, no debt you owe anyone for what happened. Wren was quiet for a long moment, looking out the kitchen window at the lake, at the dock, at the version of herself that had spent 8 years standing at the edge of that water, learning how to be still enough to survive her own grief. Can I ask you something? She said finally. Anything. Do you think he'd want this for me? My father. Would he want me back in any version of that world, even a civilian one? Holt didn't answer right away. When he finally did, his voice had gone soft, careful, the voice of a man choosing his words with the same precision he'd once used to draft classified reports. I think your father spent your entire childhood teaching you skills he hoped you'd never need to use in anger, he said slowly. I think the tragedy of that mountainside wasn't that you had those skills. It was that you needed them at 19, alone, unprepared, in a situation nobody should have put you in. He paused. I think if he could see the woman standing in that cabin right now, steady, capable, choosing this path with open eyes instead of stumbling into it by accident, I think he'd be the proudest man on earth. Not because you're following in his footsteps, because you're choosing your own, with everything he taught you carried forward on your own terms. Wren felt her eyes sting. The particular ache of grief that had, over 6 months, softened from something sharp and constant into something gentler, something that could sit beside gratitude instead of crowding it out entirely. I'll think about it, she said. Really think about it. That's all I'm asking. That evening, she drove the familiar route to the small cemetery on the edge of town, the one where her mother rested beside an empty plot that had, for 8 years, held nothing but a folded flag and a headstone with her father's name on it. His body never recovered from the mountainside, the granite marker standing as the only physical place she had to visit him. She brought flowers. She always brought flowers now, a habit she'd started the week after the amended ceremony, something small and steady to replace 8 years of avoidance. She knelt at both headstones, one after the other, and let herself simply sit in the quiet for a while, the autumn evening cooling around her, crickets starting their slow chorus in the grass beyond the cemetery fence. "I got an offer today," she said quietly, the way she'd started talking to them both, a habit that felt less strange with each passing week. "Consulting work. The kind you probably wouldn't have wanted for me, if I'm honest. But maybe the kind that would have made sense to you anyway, because you spent my whole childhood teaching me things exactly like this." The wind moved gently through the grass. "I haven't decided yet," she continued, "but I think I'm leaning toward yes. Not because I owe anyone anything. Because I think there might be other families out there right now, carrying secrets they don't understand, waiting 8 years or longer for someone to finally ask the right questions." She touched the edge of her father's headstone, fingers tracing the newly amended inscription that now told the true story of his final act. "I think I know how to ask those questions now. I think you'd want me to use that, even if it scares you a little, even if it scares me a little too." She sat there until the sun dropped fully below the horizon, until the first stars appeared faint and scattered across a darkening sky, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, something that wasn't grief and wasn't fear and wasn't the old, familiar weight of a secret she had to carry alone. It was possibility, quiet and uncertain and entirely her own. She drove home in the dark, windows cracked, to let the cool autumn air move through the truck. And by the time she reached the cabin, by the time she stood once more at the end of the dock, beneath a sky full of stars, she'd already made her decision. Not because the past demanded it, because the future, finally, felt like something worth walking toward. She picked up her phone, dialed Holt's number. He answered on the second ring, an unspoken question already waiting in his voice. "Admiral," she said, looking out at the dark water, at the reflection of the stars scattered across its still surface. "Tell me where to sign."